can use the screen that we're sharing. Yep. Can I get a thumbs up from my panelists? Cool. So welcome everyone to the latest installment of our series called FOIA and Fight Back, a webinar series from the Center for Constitutional Rights. And just a heads up that we will be recording this session. So please don't share anything that you wouldn't want us to share with the broader public. But we're always available offline later on if you want to chat about specific records requests or challenges that you've been facing. So this is a series about FOIA, the Federal Freedom of Information Act, and state open records acts, and how we can use these tools in our organizing and legal and advocacy work. I've got some amazing panelists here with me today. I'm Jessica Vosberg. I'm a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. I'm based in Birmingham, Alabama, and really passionate about Alabama open records requests as well as federal FOIAs. And I'm going to pass it to my colleagues to just quickly introduce themselves, and then I'll give y'all a little bit more of an overview of this series and what we're going to be delving into today with Alabama open records requests. So I'll pass it to Ian.
Hey everyone, so happy that we're all here together. My name's Ian, he, him pronouns. I am the Open Records Manager at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and really focus on ways to use FOIA and state open records laws in support of movement organizing and advocacy. And I will pass it over to CJ.
Hey y'all, I'm CJ. I'm a staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, also based in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm a litigator. I do prison and immigration detention litigation primarily, and get to do open records work with Ian. Again, like largely on my part, focusing on immigration issues, and also, excited to be here with you and talk about open records requests.
Thanks, Ian and CJ. And we've also got our comrade Aliyah Hussein, who's part of our advocacy department, who's going to be managing the back end of this webinar, handling the chat and stuff. So reach out to Aliyah if you have any tech issues, but we definitely welcome questions, and we'll have a Q&A portion at the end. So FOIA and Fight Back is a monthly webinar series that we, under Ian's brilliant leadership, have put together, and we're focusing both on the Federal Freedom of Information Act and then some state open records acts, including our law here in Alabama. We're also going to be covering Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia. We may do another federal FOIA training at some point too, so definitely check back and sign up for CCR emails if you're interested in future sessions. And all the Southern open records requests trainings are part of our resource called Sweet Tea with Transparency, about open records in the South. And this is a project or collaboration between our Open Records Project and CCR South, which is CCR's initiative to reconnect with our historic roots in the South. CCR actually got its start representing Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in Mississippi back in the 60s. And we now have a growing contingent of staff who are based in and rooted in and working in the South, including CJ and myself, and a few other folks who sort of range from Georgia to Mississippi to Louisiana. And so we figured it would be great to put out resources specifically on how to do this work in the South, since FOIA and open records is a key resource that lawyers and non-lawyers can use to support organizing campaigns, to demand transparency about the way that government and the private actors that our government interacts with and receives support from and contracts with, about how they're doing what they're doing and how we can use that information to advocate for justice for our people and liberation. So that, I think, is all on sort of the background. And we're going to jump right into the agenda. Housekeeping notes first. We are recording. I mentioned that already. We will answer most of our questions at the short Q&A session at the end, also feel free to use the chat function to pose the questions, and we'll either try to take them as we see them or answer them at the end. And we'll be sharing our contact information so that if you have questions that you'd prefer not to ask during the webinar or that sort of bubble up later, we're available. We're here to also workshop open records requests and ideas with you. So consider us a resource beyond this webinar. And after that, I think we are good to get started. So, okay, I should have had this one up. This is a little bit more background about us, but basically just gave this to y'all. So we did introductions. We're gonna keep this pretty 101 high level of just a real basic overview of what the Alabama Open Records Act is, what kind of records you can seek, how to submit a request. And also we're going to share some updates about recent changes that the legislature and the governor enacted last year that didn't really fundamentally change the way things work, but there's sort of some key things to highlight as a result of those recent changes. And then we're actually going to work on a sample request together. So we're going to take what we've covered and actually put it in practice by sort of starting from zero. What does it look like to build an open records request and really show like how simple it can be. It doesn't have to be anything really elaborate and long and legalistic. And then we'll have questions and answers at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to CJ to get us started on the basics of Alabama's Open Records Act.
Yeah, so Alabama Open Records Act generally allows you to request documents, records from any state agency. And what is a state agency? That's actually really broad, or a state official. It includes the agencies that are headquartered in Montgomery, like the Alabama Department of Corrections, the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency. It also includes county entities. So the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office is subject to the Alabama Open Records Act. City officials and offices are subject to the Alabama Open Records Act. And then sort of quasi-state entities or public corporations. So some of our hospital systems in the state are subject to the Alabama Open Records Act, and waterworks boards also can be subject. So anyway, it covers a lot, and it's pretty like broad in its terms. The way that our Open Records Act gets limited is really in the way that agencies interpret it and courts interpret it. So what kind of records can you get? Virtually anything that is generated in the course of state, county, city government work. You can request documents, you can request emails, you can request communications, memos, calendars and calendar invitations. You can request photos, maps, video, audio. So you want to think really like broadly and creatively when you're thinking about what kinds of documents or records may exist that you might want. Um, we'll talk more in a minute about sort of how to put it together and how to submit an open records request in Alabama, and I can add some more later on fees and fee waivers also. Jess, can I pass it to you to talk about agency delay, deny, redact issues?
Yeah, so I mean, this is really the meat or the meatless main of it. We have a right as Alabama residents to know what our government is up to seek these records. It's not something that's sort of up to the grace of an agency to decide whether to give us or not. While that right exists in theory, it's a whole lot more difficult in practice. And a lot of Alabama agencies, both at the state level and then some local government agencies, are infamous for delaying, denying, or just straight up not responding. And so what can you do when that happens? Unlike under the federal FOIA, there's no, under the Alabama's open records law, no sort of internal administrative appeals process where you would sort of, if you've been denied or they've ignored you for so long that it essentially constitutes a denial for you to sort of within the agency or within the administration to sort of appeal that and seek review of that decision. There are now, under the recent changes, some government agencies have set up their own administrative appeals process, but that's going to vary agency to agency. And so you're really going to have to do mostly some online searching to figure out whether an appeals process exists or not. The upside of there not being sort of a standard internal appeals process for denials and delays is that you can go straight to court. The downside of that is that although you don't need a lawyer to file a lawsuit, it can be very hard to navigate the legal system without one. But usually when an agency denies your request, denies part of your request, and you think that that full or partial denial is unjustified, or when they just haven't responded for so long, you can file a lawsuit in federal court. I mean, in state court, usually in the county, the circuit court for the county where the agency is based. So say you're trying to seek something from the Birmingham Police Department, you would file in Jefferson County Circuit Court, where we're located. And then another key thing to do with these requests is just persistent, dogged follow-up. So a lot of times if you're not ready to sort of take it to court or pursue whatever internal process an agency might have, just calling, going in person, sending letters, emails, when they haven't replied or when you're not satisfied with the reply you've gotten is often the most effective strategy. And we'll talk a bit more about this at the end, but there's a lot of sort of movement organizing opportunities alongside that follow-up where you could, organize a delegation to go in person, call the press and get some cameras there to get, public scrutiny on an agency's delays or denials, which can in and of themselves be a story worth telling and something that can be leveraged in a broader campaign for transparency for the records. And a lot of times, getting the records is not the end goal of a campaign. It's more about, we want to get these records because they're going to show, how this particular agency is violating people's rights. And so it's just like another step that can be used in a broader campaign. And I'll kick it back to you, CJ.
Yeah, and just some examples of ways you can use Open Records Act requests in Alabama that we've seen and partners of ours have used. Over the years, we've submitted Open Records Act requests to law enforcement entities, and we're going to talk about an example later. Ian's going to walk through an example to build a request to a county sheriff's department that is working with ICE and trying to get information about their contract with federal immigration enforcement officials. I've seen that done in other counties as well, trying to get at federal funding that local law enforcement receive to do, for example, immigration enforcement. We've seen successful open records requests in the Alabama prison context. Partners, Jess and I litigated a case about slavery and involuntary servitude in the state prisons, and a partner organization of ours was able to get a lot of really useful information about where incarcerated people in Alabama are working, what companies are utilizing that labor. So yeah, those are just some examples, and Jess and Ian may have some others of creative and useful records requests we've seen in Alabama.
I'll just chime in real quick and say that I'm not as my expertise is not specific to Alabama like Jess and CJ, but I would say just having done records requests in a number of different states and federally, it's just worth thinking creatively, like both Jess and CJ said, about where to target requests. Don't be afraid to target requests at different agencies. Um, uh, the kind of bureaucracy of government is very large, and there's all kinds of different offices and components and places that you could send a request to. And so don't feel like, especially if you were trying to get some information from a police department and you only sent your request to that police department and they never got back to you. Keep pushing on that, but it might also be worth thinking about, well, maybe that police department shares data and shares records and emails other components of that county government or that city government or that state government. Maybe I want to send some similar requests to another part of government that was in touch and sharing kind of the records I want, and maybe I can still get even those more local records through maybe a state body or a county body. So think creatively about how to kind of target your request or requests. There's a lot of different kind of places out there, and you might find one agency much more willing to kind of either produce records or discuss how to best um, produce records to you instead of a different agency.
Yeah, I'll just share like the first Alabama records request I ever submitted over a decade ago was back when I was doing worker justice work. There was a member of our worker center who was arrested and fined for he's a day laborer. He was working in a small municipality outside of Birmingham, and the police ticketed him for operating a business without a license. And we found that really fishy, basically for because he was working. Um, and we found that very suspicious and sort of wondered if there was a broader pattern. And so filed a records request with this small municipal police department for just the arrest records of every single person who had been charged with that offense. We did not find like a very large pattern of people who appear to sort of fit the profile of the the worker that we were supporting, but we saw that they were using it in raids on strip clubs and charging all the strippers with operating a business without a license. So it's like nothing, we didn't pursue any kind of campaign or legal action out of that, but sometimes you're looking for one thing and you find another. And I think it just goes to show it's like it's worth just filing these requests when something comes up, because you never know what you're going to find. And just to really emphasize too, in case this isn't something folks have done before, I mean, one of the key things that you can seek through records requests are communications. And that's also, there's sort of a lesson learned there of a lot of times when we're trying to get in touch with government officials, including ones who could potentially be an ally on certain issues, and they don't want to say anything to you over email or over a text message. It's because they know that their obligations under the Open Records Act are that they could have to hand that over if someone else requests it. And so lesson learned, like get them on the phone and you can get, or in person, you can get a lot more info that way. But a lot of times what we're doing in addition to requesting arrest records, jail records, sort of documentary things you think of like as a document that is held by a government agency is also just email communications, or even, text or signal message communications. Those should all be subject to disclosure under the Open Records Act as well. And then I can, before we move on to the next one, just comment quickly on sort of how you submit it and how much you might have to pay for it. So each agency is going to have its own process or preferences in how you submit a records request. Some are going to have their own online portal. Some are going to have a designated person that you could deliver the records request to in person or by mail. So we always just recommend checking the agency's website or calling or going in person to ask about how to submit a request, but they should make it easy. There should be like a straightforward, accessible way to submit it. You shouldn't have to pay for the request itself, although some agencies require you to sort of pay upfront in order to be able to get them to even process your request, the Department of Corrections being one of them. And they can, under the law, charge you for the records they produce, as well as if it's something where someone has to go search through either electronic files or an old file cabinet somewhere, they can charge you for that person's time. And unfortunately, in Alabama, there aren't really strong caps on what can be charged, both for paper copies and for someone's time it takes to go and search for the records that you're requesting. So it's something to think about ahead of time about whether you want to try to narrow your request because you're not in a position to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars for really voluminous records. You can request a fee waiver, but unlike under some other state laws and the federal law, there isn't a clear entitlement to a fee waiver. So it's really up to the agency whether they want to reduce the fees or grant you a fee waiver versus charging you a bunch of money. So moving on to some recent changes. So this is last year. There was a unanimously passed, so bipartisan support for quote unquote reform to the Open Records Act. It hadn't been changed in years. Our Open Records Act was very short. And that has its benefits and its downsides. These changes added a few new sections and made a few changes to the existing sections. Although it was billed as a reform, I'll say I think our take at CCR is that this really didn't make things better. Whereas we had no deadlines before under our Open Records Act, so it was really hard to sort of get an agency to produce records on any sort of a timeline. There's now some deadlines, but there's still a lot of wiggle room for agencies to extend those deadlines. It also made very clear now that you have to be an Alabama resident to submit a records request. And an agency is allowed to require proof of residency, including something like a driver's license. That residency requirement isn't a status requirement. It doesn't mean that you have to be a US citizen. It doesn't even necessarily mean that you have to be a lifelong Alabama resident, but we just recommend now if you're going to be submitting a records request and you're not based in Alabama and don't have an Alabama ID, that you find someone who does, and that person can submit the request for you. And also Alabama-based organizations should be able to submit a request, no problem. Some other things that happened with these changes last year were that they divided requests into what are considered standard and time intensive. It's up to the agency that you submit the request to, whether they think it's standard or time intensive. Time intensive requests are defined as ones that will take more than 8 hours to fulfill. So our experience so far has been anything more than a request for like a single document is treated as time intensive, but that is going to vary agency to agency. And the sort of deadlines for time intensive requests, as well as the fees, are potentially a lot higher, and the deadlines are longer. It did require, and I think this is a positive development, the state executive agencies, so all the agencies that are sort of under the purview of the governor's office, to create their own internal records request policies. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, some now have their own internal appeals process as well. Those are good because at least there's somewhere where you can go in writing and kind of see this is how you submit a request, this is what needs to go into it, and this is how the agency is going to handle it. And I think that has sort of streamlined things, at least with some agencies at the state level. Local, police departments, county sheriff's office, mayor's offices are not required to do that. They can do it if they want to. And then one other thing, and I know we have at least like one participant who is particularly interested in this, and we've been very interested in it as well, is that there was a new section added that has been, we think, like really misinterpreted by at least one agency, the Alabama Department of Corrections. This new section created a new exemption to the records request, so kind of a situation or a category of records that agencies aren't required to produce around basically saying that you can't use open records requests as an end run around the discovery process and litigation, which is where, when you sue someone and you kind of get past some initial hurdles, usually the parties can seek documents and other information from each other. And that's the discovery process, the idea being you can't just be running to the open records office every time you don't, because you just don't want to go through the process of getting discovery in your case. And it applies both to active, pending, and threatened litigation. What we've seen lately is that the Department of Corrections has used that to deny pretty much any request submitted by a lawyer, even when that lawyer is not involved in and has not threatened litigation relating to the subject of the records that they're requesting. So we're very interested in hearing about other people's experiences with that, and definitely interested in talking offline, especially if there are other agencies that are sort of employing a similarly broad and improper interpretation of that section. And then I'm just going to breeze past this next one. This kind of just goes into more detail, and this is in the explainer that was shared in the chat of how standard versus time-intensive requests are treated, just how they're defined, different deadlines, whether the agency is required to charge a fee. I think the real thing to note here is, although it does impose, a deadline for acknowledging receipt and for providing what's called a substantive response, which is like actually giving you the records or explaining why they're not going to give you the records. Although it sets, relatively tight deadlines for those, the agency is able to seek extension after extension without limitation, actually, under the law on those deadlines. So that's where I think it's really key to have a public pressure strategy and also have a litigation strategy in your back pocket if the agency either isn't complying with these deadlines and is just blowing past them, or if they're repeatedly invoking their right to seek extensions. And with that, I'll move on to building your request.
So first, let's talk about the format of the request. It doesn't have to be fancy and it's not like a full legal brief or anything like that. Like Jess said, many state agencies actually like provide a form they want you to use, or they even have an online form submission. You should use the form they provide, but you should know that you can also like attach to it a longer letter or document that really gives more detail about your request and what you're requesting. So you're not limited to the form, but if they provide a form, use the form too. Um, it's good to give a reason for your request, and in fact, many state agencies require that you write one on their provided form. It's up to you to sort of think through how detailed you want to get into the reason of your request. It can be helpful to be pretty specific about why you're requesting what you're requesting and what the public interest is in the documents you're seeking. If you plan to use your records request as like a public education tool, if you're planning to do media about your request, um, it can also be helpful to sort of persuade the agency that they need to respond to it. And we'll get to fee waivers in a minute, but laying out why your request is important and even urgent can add to your case for a fee waiver or fee discount. So again, like up to you on how detailed you want to be on the reason for your request. But if you're thinking of records request as like a movement tool, it can be really helpful to sort of lay out the import in the request itself. Um, so you want to think about which agencies you're going to search. And like I said, that the agencies and public officers who are subject to the open records request in Alabama are really it's a really broad group. It's important to submit a records request to a separate request to every agency you want documents from. So let's say you want documents about implementation of a particular law related to prisons. Well, you probably want to submit a records request to the Alabama Department of Corrections, but you may also want to submit a records request to the Attorney General's office or to the governor's office, other state agencies that might have something to do with how a law gets interpreted and implemented at a particular state office or agency. So think broadly. You can also specify, like if you know that there's sort of a sub office within the entity you're seeking, you can be clear that you want that searched. And you don't have to limit the search to that, but you can say, I want you to search the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, including but not limited to the Office of Homeland Security. We have a state Office of Homeland Security, if folks didn't know. And it's a sub-office of ALEA, the main law enforcement agency. So if you want both of those entities searched, you can just be clear that you know this sub-entity exists and you want it searched, but also search the larger agency. Um, in terms of the kinds of records you're seeking, you want to be as specific as you can, naming the kinds of records, and we've given a lot of examples, but specifically documents, communication, signal messages, text messages, audio, video, photos, maps, any of that. Include broad categories like documents and communications that would really encompass all of those things, but be specific when you know you want something specific. Um, and you also need to give a time frame for your request. So, um, Alabama agencies have sort of varying records retention policies. They really vary by agency and also the kind of document. Don't worry about that. Like if you know if you want to ask for a document, you should ask for it and let the agency tell you kind of what their retention policy is and whether the documents have been destroyed or not. Um, but you do want to give a time frame because the search you're asking them to do has to be reasonable, right? So you can't ask them to search for 20 years worth of documents. You sort of want to think through, what are you focused on, and maybe build in a year or two buffer around the thing, the event, the specific document that you're focused on, to keep it limited. And again, we'll talk about fees in a minute, but that time frame that you request is one of the ways you can kind of negotiate with the agency on reducing fees and also getting documents more quickly if you are able to narrow the time frame of documents they're searching for. Um, let's see, I want to make sure you also, you know, the Alabama Records Act requires that you be reasonably specific in your request. So again, you could ask for all contract bids within the last year submitted to a particular agency. But if what you're really looking for is contract bids related to construction of a new interstate in Birmingham, then be specific. Say that's what you're looking for, because again, that will help the agency find your documents faster and limit the amount of fees you're charged. Um, Agencies aren't, and this actually goes to one of the questions we've gotten. Agencies in Alabama aren't required to create documents in response to a records request. So if you ask the Tuscaloosa Sheriff's Office for a list of all arrests in the last month, if they don't keep a list like that, like just handy, they don't have to create one for you. Um, you could ask for that list, but also think about what are the underlying records that would show that information, and you can also ask for those. So if you want to know the names or dates or charges for all the arrests in Tuscaloosa for the last month, ask for the list, but also ask for the arrest records in case the agency doesn't keep it, you can create your own list. Based on the records themselves. And again, that's something, these records requests are negotiable once you will hear back from the agency's records administrator about the timeline and about the fees, and there's opportunities to kind of narrow them along the way so that, if they come back and tell you there's no such list, you could submit a new request, but that starts the timeline over. So just think broadly from the start, and remember that agencies don't have to create their own records. Now fees, I think we've already said, their agencies are allowed to charge a reasonable fee in Alabama for records requests productions. Um, there's not really any guidance on what reasonable is. They often charge like a per page rate if they're making paper copies. You do have a right to inspect documents, like in person at an agency, but you don't get to keep copies of them. So most of the time when we do these records requests, what we're really asking for is copies of documents. It's good to specify if you're fine with getting documents in electronic form, that that's your preference, and provide your email address and other contact information so that they can produce it that way. That's one way to cut down on costs so there's not paper copying happening. Um, but in terms of, sort of keeping the costs manageable, again, you want to think about really what you're asking for, like the most reasonable time frame you can give them, and give them more specific guidance if you can on where to search and what to search. Um, you can ask for a fee waiver. There's not really a provision for that under Alabama law. There is in the federal FOIA statute, but it doesn't hurt to ask. When you do that, you're going to lay out sort of why the records are in the public interest. If you're doing this request on behalf of a nonprofit or an organizing group, or a civic group, sort of explain that, and that this isn't like for a commercial purpose. You're not going to make money off of publishing these records and that sort of thing. Um, and you can ask for a waiver, you can ask for a discount based on those same principles. So that request is for the waiver or discount is something you're also going to put into your full records request and attach it to that form from the agency. Um, and the last couple things, just be sure you provide your contact information. So your mailing address, phone number, and email, so that the agency can get a hold of you and give you updates and also produce the records to you. Um, and then you want to be reminding the agency of its timelines, and the chart just showed you under the statute, that they need to respond to you within a certain timeline. And then once they've acknowledged receipt of your request, they've got to produce the documents within a certain timeline unless they tell you that they can't, that they're giving themselves an extension.
And I'll say too, just on that last piece, it's so key to like make yourself your own calendar of like, I'm going to follow up with the agency on this is when it's due. This is when I'm going to follow up. This is when I'm going to bug them again. This is when we're going to further escalate. And also to have, if you are requesting more than just a couple of documents, to have a like data doc review plan. Last thing you want to do is like submit a request, you get a bunch of stuff back, and it's like you don't have the capacity to actually go through it all and extract what can be useful, and share it with the public, with reporters, with the folks that you're organizing with. So just kind of gaming that out ahead of time too can be really helpful. And I think that dovetails nicely into sort of movement, organizing, advocacy possibilities of records requests. Certainly like the actual submission of a request is like a newsworthy moment and can be a flashpoint to organize around and gain publicity around. I've been part of, very public, sort of dramatic deliveries of requests where you actually go and bring them to the person that you're seeking records from. And that can be a great moment to, share on social media or to call reporters to have them cover it. And cover not just the request itself, but whatever the issue is that sort of led you to bring this request to the agency to begin with. Journalists are a great resource both for covering, that you're submitting a request, what you're seeking, denials, and what you get, but also journalists are themselves often very skilled records requesters. They're regularly using the state and federal open records laws. So a lot of times they're a resource to consult as you're building your request. They may have a treasure trove of documents that they've already have obtained. They may have, good contacts at the same agencies where you're going to be seeking records from, and sort of can give you inside information on the best way to style your request, to get in touch with someone if you're just getting ignored. So journalists are like a really key ally and resource in this work, both for covering it and because they do this work themselves. Legislators, I know it's like a pretty rough field in Alabama, but we do have some folks in the state legislature who can be allies on this sort of stuff, including some Republican legislators who are just open records request nerds and were involved in, these supposed reforms that were passed last year and who are passionate about this issue because it does in some ways sort of cut across political ideologies, this idea that we have a right to know what our government is up to. So that can be another resource to think about for both sort of public and behind closed doors pressure when you're not getting what you want through, directly from the agency. As I sort of touched on before, just like thinking about publishing what you get, whether that's, you work somewhere where you have your own website where documents can be published, working with a reporter to get them in the media. And then there's a lot of great, third-party sites that can be used to host documents and just get them out to the broadest swath of the public possible and sort of outsource that doc review too, right? Like sometimes that's an option too, where you're going to get a big dump and then you're going to share it with people and other people are each going to review those records to, for what's most interesting and useful to them. And then also like the sort of meta request where you do a records request, you get stuff back, you review those documents and you realize, there's a name in there that is really interesting and you want to go and request that person's communications with, regarding a certain topic, or like a new contract comes to light. And so like building on one request can lead to other requests. And if you want to get like even to another meta level, you can always submit records requests for the records requests that were submitted. So if you want to know what other people are seeking from the agency or what the agency has produced to other people who have filed open records requests, those are themselves public records too. And so you can request them. And I'll just say too, I think, because open records requests, and we'll get into building one in a second, are like a relatively low lift in terms of it's not some big, long, elaborate thing. It doesn't take a ton of expertise. You don't need a whole legal team to do it. It's something that provides a lot of the same sort of flashy, newsworthy moments and opportunities to highlight like deeper injustices. that like major litigation would, but you don't need all of the resources it would take to, file some big new civil rights lawsuit against a police department. And so I think thinking about it in that way, and also it can ideally work on sort of a shorter timeline too. There's like a lot of good opportunities to use it as a flashpoint in broader organizing campaigns. All right, I think I'm going to stop sharing now and kick it over to you, Ian.
Sounds good. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. If I can find the correct screen, 1 second, everyone. Um, and okay, and please, I can't see the chat when I'm in this mode, so just let me know if I need to stop talking. I'm going to just touch on a couple quick things about kind of how building a request out and how I would go about it. And I think all of us kind of generally would go about this. And starting here at our online resource, I know Aaliyah has put this in the chat already, FOIA Basics for Activists. It has a lot of different information, but it specifically has the Sweet Tea for Transparency resource focusing on the South. And this is one of the sample requests that is posted on there in regards to Alabama. I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel, so you guys should feel free to cut and paste and use these as uh, kind of templates for your own requests. I definitely do. You can see these little eyes have a little kind of information if you hover over them, but just cut and paste the text if you need to. I'm going to start building my request here. Again, I don't have it. I know that there's limited amount of time, but couple basic things. Date, you want to make sure you date your request because you want to have a date to reference to. And then address is going to be all those different agencies and potentially the people and the contact people at those agencies. And then we're going to get into kind of putting together the start of your request. I think typically we like to just at least reference the law to make it very clear this is an open records request. It doesn't have to be super legalistic, but I think this sentence right here, where we're referencing the law, we put something like that at the start. Please consider this letter as a request to the city. Again, what CJ I think said, make sure if there is a form that an agency wants you to use that form, but you can just attach your request onto that form, especially if that form isn't giving you enough room to kind of put everything you want into the request. And like we talked about, you could give a little bit of a description of why you're asking for these records, especially if you're doing advocacy around your request. I'd put that kind of at the top, at the very start of your request, because that's more for the public. It's more for your partner organizations, organizers, et cetera, journalists who want to kind of immediately know what's going on with this request. Why is it important? What do I need to know about it? The reasons for the records that they're asking for. And then I just get into kind of records. You can title this however you want. Records we seek. I'm just going to title it off that. And here's where you might say something like, we seek records between January 1st, 2024 and what is June now? June 30th, 2025, right? And then I would number each of your requests, kind of numbering them rather than bullet pointing them or kind of putting them together in kind of a lump in the request. Makes it easier to reference when you start negotiating or talking back and forth with an agency. You can say, hey, I see that you sent me some documents in response to number 1 and number 2 of my request, but I didn't see anything in your response in regards to number 3. And that makes it just easier to kind of reference and move forward as you hopefully get records and talk to the different agencies. Now I'm just going to kind of show you how I will go about just kind of figuring out what we want to do. So this request I'm going to put together is in relation to some work that we are already working on, along with the National Lawyers Guild National Immigration Project. Shout out to Stephanie, who I think is in the audience right now, around ICE restarting their Etowah Detention Center in Alabama. We filed a FOIA request in regards to this already with ICE. But I think it's going to probably be worth filing a state request kind of, and this is something that is a useful strategy to think about, especially when you're dealing with federal agencies who are kind of doing things with local agencies or local state players, is filing both a FOIA and a state request, seeing if you can potentially play them off each other, seeing if you can get different kinds of information that can be helpful to both requests as they move forward. And they also might be moving forward on different timelines, and so it's worth kind of spreading the wealth, as it were. So in regards to Etowah, I've already done some Googling. I think there's a couple things I want to know. I want to know who I'm targeting. I think I already know that it's going to be the Etowah County Sheriff's Office that runs the jail there, that's going to be in charge of the detention center. And so I want to know how I file a request with that agency. And so here I've kind of Googled Etowah County Jail, Etowah County Jail public records request. These are kind of the things that I might throw in there to kind of figure out who's the contact person, where do I send my request to? You can see that Google AI has given me a bunch of answers. They might be interesting answers, but I would recommend not trusting what Google AI or any other AI tells you is the correct answer at this point. Maybe just use them as clues to make sure, but I would go to the actual websites of the government, right? So here's Etowah County website. I think I had, let's just go to the Etowah County Sheriff's Office. I'm not sure why it's taking me to the inmate roster, but I'm just going to click this link anyway. We're going to go up here to the main website. And I've already done this, so I'm just going to kind of narrate very quickly what I know I've already done. What I would typically do is, okay, where is the contact form for public records? Now, the law does say that all agencies are supposed to have some type of public records coordinator. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be available on the website. Agencies, especially law enforcement agencies, do not like being transparent. They want to hide kind of and make it as hard as possible often for you to be able to kind of request records. Here I'm scrolling around. I don't see anything about contacting beyond, reporting a crime, 911. Here's a contact thing. This is worth knowing. Here's an address. I may have to send my request to this address, but I see no obvious forms. I've already clicked around earlier today on here. Departments, I went up here. What kind of departments do we have? Aviation, civil servants. There's a lot of different departments. However, there really isn't as far as I could find, a public records department. And so if you can't find a public records department, that's okay. Again, I would just take this address, or if there's a general email address, and cut and paste that into your request, right? So that's one. Sorry about the formatting issues here, but we're not going to worry about that too much. That's one thing to do. So kind of figure out how and where you're going to send it. I think that it's worth also sending a request to not just the kind of law enforcement agency, but maybe the local government as well, right? So again, we're looking for records related to the ICE detention center being contracted and built or restarted in Etowah County. And one thing I realize, I'm kind of jumping around here just because of the time, but let's just build out this request real fast. Communications between Etowah County Sheriff's Office and ICE, any and all records related to contracts, agreements, or other similar documents shared between, I'm going to call it the ECSO and ICE. And we can add more on there later. One way to figure out the types of records that might be out there, and also to kind of bolster your request, is going to be to look at what kind of news coverage has happened already in relation to the issue that you're interested in. So I Googled Etowah County ICE Detention Center because I knew that this was happening from the organizers that we were in touch with. And there was a number of different links that came up, and I looked at the recent coverage related to this reopening of the Etowah County Jail for immigrants, right? And so in here, there's going to be all kinds of information, and I know we're nearing time, so I'm just going to kind of throw a couple kind of specific pointers regards this. One is kind of finding a number of recent articles like this and just citing to them in your request, whether it's, I mean, I think you might want to take the whole title and the author of the article, but putting the link in there, you can also print the article out and attach it as an exhibit, um, uh, is really useful in kind of showing these law enforcement agencies we know what we're talking about. Because often, unfortunately, law enforcement agencies and government agencies like to say, "Oh, well, we just don't know what you're talking about. We don't have any records about that. We've never heard of that policy." Even if it's obvious that they do know, it's good to kind of prove, "Hey, we know what we're doing here. Don't give us the runaround." So if you would say you had a description here, we seek records related to the ICE detention center reopening at County Jail. And then you could drop a footnote and just put a bunch of these media sites in there showing, hey, we know what we're talking about, right? The other thing that's even more important is to read through these articles and find places where they're already giving information. So here we have the sheriff. He's saying they agreed to take the, and he's talking about the facilities that the Biden administration made it close, blah, 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 blah. But there can be lots of good tidbits within these articles that you can either cite to, or you can use as ways to say, hey, make sure we search the emails of this guy, Sheriff Horton, right? Make sure we search the emails of his staff. And then maybe spend 5 minutes Googling Sheriff Horton and seeing how big is his office? Who's working in his office? Are there people in his office that seem like they might be the custodians of records such as contracts, agreements with ICE, or be talking about kind of putting together these contracts and these agreements with ICE? The other thing is maybe there are other government officials that you didn't know about. Maybe some commissioner from Etowah County has a quote in here too, is talking about, oh, we love ICE. We're really excited about this. Well, then maybe target their office as well. Mention them by name in your request. And then the final thing, here's another article here. The final thing I'd say is any article where they're discussing something and they're getting quotes from local officials, whether it's Horton or whether it's someone else. These are also places to say, to ask about communications related to that article. Because when that agency, that when that reporter was doing that reporting, they reached out most likely to that agency and they send a request saying, hey, we're writing about this. What's your perspective on this policy? What's your answer to these questions I'm sending you over email? And there are often juicy things in the internal exchanges of an agency talking about how do we respond to this reporter? How did he find out about these things? What do we say now? And you can ask for kind of the emails and communications around both the publication of that article and the reactions to it, as well as kind of the reactions and conversations in regards to the pre-publication time. And I'm going to stop there just because I know we only have a couple minutes left. But as always, I am happy to as we all are, answer questions and follow up on all of this in the future.
Yeah, so I think we've answered questions that have come up, but want to give a chance if folks want to post any last questions in the chat or through the Q&A function. And in the meantime, just throwing up this last slide that has some helpful links and also our contact information in case any of y'all want to follow up directly about records requests that you're cooking up.
Yeah, and seeing no more questions, I'll wrap us up. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks Ian, Jess, and Aaliyah, my CCR colleagues, for doing this. Reach out to us if you have questions about federal or state records requests. We're happy to be a resource. Happy to, pinpoint strategies and brainstorm. Keep an eye out on CCR's website, on our email list for upcoming webinars. Like Jess said, we're going to do a couple more focused on Southern state records requests, and then federal FOIA request webinars, I'm sure will be forthcoming as well. Yeah, and we look forward to staying in touch and hearing about really cool, creative, exciting records requests that you all do in the future.